Have you ever imagined what it would be like if the happiest day of your life turned in seconds into your biggest nightmare? It was a clear morning, the kind of day that seems to promise good things. The sun shone over a city where everything was grand, from skyscrapers to dreams. It was in that scenario that a young woman named Isabel stepped, for the first time, on the ground that would change the course of her existence forever. She came from a simple place in the French countryside, where the windows looked out onto lavender fields and time seemed to move slowly. But there, in a city made of glass, gold, and sand, everything ran faster, even her heart. Isabel didn't know that she was about to live a love story as intense as it was unlikely, much less that this love would come at a very high price. She arrived for the wedding of her cousin, Claire, a vibrant woman who had fallen in love with a local businessman and decided to live there, among the modern palaces and ancient markets. Claire had insisted that Isabel be her maid of honor. And even with her heart full of doubts and her mind still stuck on what she had left behind, including a lukewarm relationship with an ex-boyfriend who valued her little, she went. Because, deep down, I felt like I needed a break from the life I lived out of obligation. As soon as she left the airport, the heat enveloped her like a warning. It was different from the mild climate of her hometown, and the warm wind carried the smell of spices, sea air, and something else, something she couldn't identify, but that made her shiver inside. A feeling? Perhaps. Or just nervousness in the face of the unknown. The hotel where Claire put her up looked like something out of an enchanted tale. Fountains danced to the sound of soft melodies that came from nowhere, chandeliers hung from the ceiling like waterfalls frozen in crystal, and everything around seemed to shine brighter than it should. But what caught my attention the most was the feeling that, in that place, anything could happen. On the second day after her arrival, during the couple's welcome reception, Isabel met someone who would change everything. His name was Adam, the groom's cousin. He was discreet and elegant, with eyes as dark as the desert night and a smile that seemed to hide ancient stories. It didn't take more than a glance for the two to connect in a strange and natural way, as if they had already met in another life. As the guests celebrated, they chatted. About books, cultures, travel, philosophy, and even fears that neither of them knew they could confess out loud. When they found out, the lights were lower, the music was softer, and the room was almost empty. In that instant, Isabel knew something had started. But what she didn't know, and perhaps no one there did, was that there were eyes watching from a distance. Someone who knew Isabel better than she knew herself. Someone who never accepted being left behind. And that someone was willing to cross continents to interrupt any chance of happiness she dared to build. In the following days, between walks through the desert, dinners under the stars, and confessions in the dim light, Isabel felt the world change inside her. For the first time, she didn't need to ask permission to be who she was. Adam listened to her attentively, admired her courage, and made her laugh like no one had in a long time. It was as if she had been released from an invisible prison, and that, in itself, was frightening. Because when freedom arrives, along with it comes the fear of losing it. Claire's wedding was approaching, and the city seemed to breathe with anticipation. What Isabel didn't know was that that would be the last day of peace she would have for a long, long time. Because love, when it is real, attracts light, but also shadow. And some shadows are too disguised to be noticed in time. The day before the wedding, the desert seemed quieter than usual. The clear sky displayed a sea of stars, and the warm night air brought a strange sense of anticipation. Isabel couldn't sleep. She slowly ran her hands over the fabric of the dress she would wear the next day, feeling the textures and memories that had already accumulated on that trip. Every moment with Adam was a new memory, and the feeling that there was something bigger brewing between them. Outside, the city lights sparkled like jewels scattered across the sand. It was hard to believe that this place, where the past and the future touched all the time, could hide something dark. And yet, there was something about her that couldn't completely relax. It was as if, behind all that shine, there was an invisible presence, lurking. On the morning of the wedding, everything happened like in a dream. Claire was radiant, the setting impeccable, the ceremony magical. Isabel, next to her cousin, felt grateful to be there. And Adam, watching her from the other side of the improvised altar, didn't hide how much his eyes were looking only for hers. It was at that moment that her heart took its first real step into the unknown, and she didn't know, at that moment, whether she should move forward or back. Hours later, as the guests dispersed among dancing, laughter, and photos, Adam discreetly pulled her away. They walked to one of the hotel's high balconies, from where they could see the entire horizon. The lights merged with the dunes, and the city seemed to float over the desert. It was there that he held her hand, firmly, for the first time. "If I asked you to stay longer, would you consider it?" he asked, looking into her eyes with a seriousness that cut the air. Isabel didn't respond right away. There was a lot at stake: life in her city, work, family, and an ex-boyfriend who still insisted on sending her messages as if she belonged to him. But at that moment, she understood something simple and inevitable: it wasn't just a trip. It wasn't just a passing romance. It was the beginning of a story that she herself didn't know where it could take, and that's why, more than fear, she felt curiosity. The same curiosity that makes someone open a forbidden door, only to discover what is hidden behind it. She said yes. Not in words, but in a smile that said it all. And Adam understood. They returned to the party, and she felt that there was now an invisible connection between them, something stronger than words could describe. But while this was happening, in some corner of the city, a man was watching a cell phone screen with his eyes half closed. The wedding photos were already circulating on the networks. There was Isabel, smiling, happy, with another man. It was him, Michael, the ex-boyfriend she thought she had left in the past. For him, this wasn't just a betrayal. It was an affront. And in his twisted mind, Isabel had no right to move on without him. That same night, he made a call. Nobody knows what was said. But days later, something terrible would happen. Something that would forever change the fate of those who were just beginning to discover love. The next day, Isabel woke up with her cell phone full of messages from Michael. Some begged for forgiveness. Others threatened. He felt a chill down his spine but decided to ignore it. She didn't want the past to ruin what she was building with Adam. But the past, when it refuses to be forgotten, tends to find unexpected ways of returning. She spent that day with Claire, helping with the last details before the honeymoon. At night, he found Adam on the same terrace as before. They talked about everything, and nothing. It was one of those nights when time seems to slow down, as if the universe offered a brief moment of peace before the storm. And they were about to dive into it without knowing it. It was the next day that everything collapsed. But what really happened? And why, just when love seemed to have finally found space to blossom, did fate decide to crush it so brutally? The warm city wind blew as if it wanted to say something. Maybe let me know. Maybe console. But that morning, Isabel wasn't paying attention to the signs. It was light, almost floating. The last few days had been the most intense of his life. She had met someone who, in a short time, awakened in her everything that had seemed dormant for years. Adam was different. It was the opposite of everything she had experienced with Michael. Attentive, curious, kind, he really saw her. That day, she woke up earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, but she was already sitting by the bedroom window, watching the sky change color. I felt a mixture of anxiety and calm. It was strange. As if he knew, deep down, that tranquility had a time to end. While having coffee with Claire, Isabel spoke of Adam as if speaking of a precious discovery. Claire, who had always known her cousin as someone reserved and discreet, now saw her shine with an intensity she didn't remember seeing before. "I've never seen you like this. There's something different in your eyes," he commented. Isabel just smiled. And in fact, something had changed. She was no longer the same person who arrived in the country a few days earlier, carrying doubts, memories, and old wounds. That afternoon, Adam took her to see a hidden corner of the city, an ancient garden between stone walls and cool shadows. a place that few tourists knew about. They sat on a stone bench under a tree and remained there, talking, laughing, and exchanging stories. She talked about her childhood, her dreams of traveling the world, and her fear of becoming an invisible person in her own life. He listened to everything with real attention, as if her every word mattered. And then, at a moment when time seemed to have stopped, he held her hand and said, "Do you have any idea how valuable you are? How much do you deserve to be happy without carrying anyone on your shoulders?" Isabel felt her eyes burn. She was so used to being ignored, to being told that she dreamed too much, that it took her a while to believe that someone was encouraging her to be who she was, without guilt. And at that very moment, she was sure she was in love. Not in an impulsive way, not out of need, but with a calm clarity. Like someone who finds, without looking, what was always missing. The end of the afternoon arrived like a warm hug. They walked through the old streets of the center, looking at shop windows, buying small souvenirs, and exchanging smiles that said more than any statement. It was simple happiness, without great promises. Just now. But now it was all she wanted. Later that same night, Adam invited her to dinner. A discreet restaurant facing a lit canal. Lights reflected in the water and created golden designs. Isabel got ready as if she were going to a meeting that could change her story, and maybe it was. Dinner was light, full of small exchanges, subtle touches, and long looks. In the end, as they walked together along the ancient stone sidewalk, he said, "If I had met you before, I would have waited as long as it took to find you." She stopped. His heart sank, and for a moment he wanted to cry. Not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. Because at that moment, she realized that what she felt was no longer a doubt. It was certainty. And I wasn't alone in that. Adam knew it too. But when love grows fast, it seems the world tries to remember that not everything is so simple. The next day, a message from Michael appeared on Isabel's cell phone screen: "You can run away, but I will find you." She didn't tell Adam. I didn't want to ruin that moment or worry him. But something inside her began to stir. As if an invisible weight had returned to settle on his shoulders. Still, she chose to follow. I wanted to live that love until the last second. Even without knowing how many seconds were left. The late afternoon sky was dyed an orange tone that seemed to paint the world with delicacy. Isabel and Adam walked along the edge of a peaceful canal, where small boats danced in the gentle breeze. Everything there seemed untouched, protected from the noise of the real world. And perhaps that was why, next to him, she felt as if she were living outside of time. In the last few days, every gesture between the two had gained more meaning. A touch on the arm, a long look, a silent smile. The connection between them was made of details, not promises. And it was precisely this lightness that made everything seem so right. But Isabel still carried a weight. Ever since Michael's message, something inside her had closed down. He tried to hide it, hiding his worries behind laughter and distracted comments, but Adam noticed. He saw beyond the surface, he always did. That night, as the two sat on the hotel balcony to watch the city turn on its lights one by one, he broke the silence with a simple question: "Are you afraid of something?" Isabel hesitated. He took a deep breath. "I wanted to say no, that everything was fine, that I was just tired." But for the first time in a long time, he decided not to lie. He lowered his eyes, thought about the right words, and finally said, "There is someone who doesn't accept that I have moved on. Someone from my past." Adam didn't ask anything else. He just reached out and held her hand firmly. "I didn't need answers. The gesture said it all: I'm here." She allowed herself to rest in that gesture. For a few minutes he forgot what came next. The next day started with simple plans: a walk through the historic streets, lunch in a hidden cafe, and, in the late afternoon, a drive to a high point in the city, from where you could see the sea and the desert meeting on the horizon. It was supposed to be just another perfect day. But fate had other plans. On the way back, Adam's car was followed. Isabel noticed it first, a dark vehicle, too close together, mirroring every movement. He tried to ignore it, to rationalize it. But when the car suddenly accelerated and crashed into the back of theirs, there was no more room to deny it. It was real. And it was intentional. The impact was brutal. The car spun, left the road, and fell down a hill. The world turned upside down. Everything happened too quickly. Screams, shattered glass, the smell of smoke mixed with hot dust. And then, silence. Isabel didn't know how much time had passed when she opened her eyes. She was trapped, injured, but conscious. The first sound he heard was his own heart racing. The second was the sound of someone's voice calling, "Adam. Adam." She tried to move, but her body didn't respond properly. She screamed his name, feeling the despair rising like a wave. Nothing. Time seemed to have frozen. Outside, sirens began to approach, and voices echoed among the wreckage. When they finally took her out of the car, the sunlight blinded her for a moment. His eyes searched for only one thing, him. Among the paramedics, among the screams, among the bodies. Until he saw it. Lying on the ground, surrounded by rescuers, motionless. One of the men was trying to revive him. Another screamed for equipment. But Isabel already knew. I knew before any words were spoken. Her world, so newly discovered, had been brutally ripped away. What came next was a blur. Hospital. Morphine. News. Silence. And within all of this, a pain that found no place to support itself. Because it wasn't just the loss of Adam. It was the loss of everything she finally believed she could be. She found herself alone in a foreign country, surrounded by faces that tried to comfort but had no way of understanding. Because no one, there or anywhere, could feel what she felt, that true love, the one that arrived late, had left too soon. But one question kept echoing, even in the midst of grief: why did that happen? And worse. Was it really an accident? The pain didn't scream. She whispered. It whispered in the long mornings, when Isabel woke up sweaty, with the feeling that Adam was still there, lying next to her. He whispered when she looked at the cup of tea she used to share with him on the terrace, when she realized that the places in the city had changed their meaning. They were the same places, but now they belonged to a time that would never return. The days following the accident were a silent plunge into emptiness. Isabel said little. The word seemed useless. The hospital released his body, but his soul was still trapped at the moment of impact. There was no going back for what was broken inside her. And the worst part wasn't Adam's absence. The worst thing was her absence. Because, deep down, Isabel no longer knew who she was. For years, she had molded herself to please. To fit into the relationship with Michael, to live up to family expectations, to fit into the world around. Adam had been the first person to see her beyond that. And now that he was gone, she found herself faced with a question she never had the courage to ask: who am I when no one is looking? Claire, his cousin, tried to help. He brought flowers, prepared soups, and sat in silence next to her. But even with all the affection, Isabel felt like she was alone inside. It was like walking down a long hallway with doors closed on both sides. And on each door, a version of her that she had locked, afraid to open. It was only after 2 weeks that Isabel left the room she was staying in. The sun seemed more intense than I remembered. The sounds of the city hit your ears like uneven music. Still, she decided to walk. Aimless. Just walk. I needed to breathe. I needed to feel like I still existed. During that walk, something strange happened. Isabel passed a street artist, who was painting small pictures next to a fountain. One of them caught his attention. It wasn't the prettiest painting. It was simple. A woman is sitting on the floor with her back turned, watching the sea. But there was something about that image that made her stop. The painter, a man with a serene face and a low voice, noticed her interest and commented, "This woman is looking for answers, but she doesn't know they are inside her." Isabel froze. That sentence went through her like a cold blade. He bought the painting, almost without realizing it. She didn't know exactly why, but she felt that it needed to accompany her. It was a reminder. A symbol. That night, for the first time since the accident, she wrote. He took out a notebook that he had kept in his suitcase and began to record what he felt. Didn't organize the sentences. Didn't try to make sense. Just spilled words. Pain. Longing. Fear. Anger. Gratitude. Blame. All. It was there that he understood, it was not enough to survive the loss. She needed to save herself. In the following days, writing became a ritual. In the morning, I sat on the porch with my notebook and a pen. Sometimes I couldn't complete a page. Other times, I wrote for hours. And in this silent process, she found pieces that she had left behind. She began to remember the things she loved before she became Michael's girlfriend. He remembered the books he read in secret, the drawings he made in boring classes, the music he listened to in the early hours of the morning with headphones so as not to disturb anyone. And something inside her began to move. A small but lively flame. Isabel, without realizing it, was coming to her senses. One afternoon, Claire took her to a local cultural center. There was a contemporary art exhibition. Upon entering, Isabel was invaded by a mix of sensations, curiosity, nervousness, and excitement. It was the first time he had allowed himself to do something new since everything happened. He observed the works carefully. Some bothered her. Others moved her. But in all of them, there was a message: the world continued to create, even after the chaos. And if the world could do it, so could she. Later, sitting in a small cafe next to the gallery, Claire held her hand firmly and said, "You still have your whole life ahead of you. Don't let pain be your home. Make it a starting point." Isabel didn't respond. But a tear fell, silently. That sentence, like the one from the painter in the square, struck a chord. That night, she returned to her room, took the painting out of her backpack, and hung it on the wall. After that, she sat in front of him for long minutes. In silence. The woman's face in the painting, even from the back, seemed to be talking to her. It was like looking into a mirror of a sleeping version of herself. And so, little by little, without rushing, Isabel began to open the internal doors that she had kept locked for so long. Mornings are no longer a burden. There was still pain, yes, but now it was different. Isabel was beginning to realize that grief wasn't something you overcame, it was something you learned to carry. And in this silent walk between memories and new beginnings, she began to rediscover what it meant to live for herself. I didn't need to pretend anymore. He didn't need to smile to hide it, nor shape himself to fit into too tight spaces. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to exist without apologies. That, in itself, was revolutionary. One calm afternoon, while organizing his things in his room, he found an old sketchbook that he had taken with him by chance. It was almost forgotten at the bottom of the bag. As he leafed through it, something lit up in his eyes. They were old doodles, made as a teenager, portraits of streets, lost looks, ideas that never came to fruition. He stood there for a while, slowly flipping through the pages. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was memory. It was part of her. Moved by this silent reunion with her creative past, Isabel bought some pencils and paper at a nearby stationery store. He started drawing again. No technique, no rush, no goals. Just letting your hands tell what words couldn't yet express. His features spoke of longing, but also of hope. They were like seeds being sown into the ground of new life. Over time, Claire noticed the change. "You're more present," she said one morning as they were having coffee together. Isabel smiled slightly. She still didn't feel whole, but she wasn't broken like before. I was beginning to understand that Adam's love had not been lost. He had left roots. And it was these roots that supported her now. Still, there were things she needed to face. And one of them was Michael. His messages had stopped since the accident, but the shadow of his presence still haunted her thoughts. Isabel knew she couldn't move forward without closing this cycle. It was like a half-open door in the back of the mind, through which fear peeked in from time to time. With courage, he wrote a letter. Not to send, just to release. He put on paper everything he had been holding onto for years, the hurt, the anger, the guilt, and the weight of suffocating expectations. And when he finished, he read it out loud. He didn't cry. It didn't shake. She just took a deep breath and burned the paper on the balcony, watching the smoke rise as if taking away what no longer belonged to her. From that moment on, Isabel began to change small habits. I woke up early. He was without a cell phone. She spent more time alone, but she didn't feel lonely. I discovered the pleasure of cooking simple dishes, listening to old music, and writing without a filter. These small choices reconnected her with something she had lost, the ability to hear herself. One night, Claire brought him a proposal. A friend was organizing a small local art exhibition and wanted to open up space for budding artists. "You should show your drawings," he said matter-of-factly. Isabel froze. He never thought about exposing anything. For her, what she drew was too intimate, too fragile. But the next day, as he reviewed his sketches, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Each image told a piece of the journey he had been on since the accident. A raging sea, a solitary figure on top of a hill, a pair of clasped hands surrounded by mist. Those lines weren't just art. They were witnesses of the reconstruction of it. He accepted the invitation. The exhibition would be discreet, in a welcoming space, surrounded by local artists. It wasn't grand, but it represented a huge step for someone who had relearned how to walk emotionally. On opening day, Isabel arrived with a heavy heart and sweaty hands. He didn't know if anyone would understand his drawings. But when she saw a couple standing in front of one of her works, the one that depicted the woman watching the sea, and heard them comment quietly, "It looks like us," she understood. It wasn't about making beautiful art. It was about touching someone. And in that moment, he felt that Adam would have been proud. That night, when she returned home, she sat alone on the porch and looked up at the sky. The stars seemed clearer. The air tasted lighter. For the first time in a long time, Isabel wasn't burdened with being who others wanted her to be. She was becoming, little by little, the person she needed to be. And if you've come this far feeling every word, every silence, every step of this transformation, maybe this story is also touching something inside you. So if this journey is moving you, consider leaving a like. This shows us that stories like this have a place in your heart. Isabel always thought she knew the world. I had read about him in books, watched films, visited some places, but it was only when living outside his country that he understood how everything he knew was just the surface. The city he was in now, the one that sparkled in his eyes at the beginning of the trip, wasn't just made up of mirrored skyscrapers and fancy dinners. Behind the futuristic architecture and colorful markets, there was an ancient culture full of rules, traditions, codes, and silences that spoke more than words. At first, she was enchanted by what she saw. The local women's long, flowing costumes seemed to dance in the wind, while the men, with their impeccable turbans and serene posture, walked as if carrying centuries of wisdom on their shoulders. There was a visible respect between generations, a way of treating time that didn't flow like in Europe, it flowed slowly, as if each moment deserved attention. But over time, Isabel began to realize that the beauty of the local culture was accompanied by invisible barriers. Expressions of affection in public were frowned upon. Prolonged glances could be misinterpreted. And, above all, being a woman meant following a series of unspoken but clearly expected behaviors. Once, when she entered a small restaurant alone, she noticed the discreet looks of some people around her. They weren't hostile, but they carried a kind of silent surprise, as if something was out of place. She wore a dress that, in her hometown, would be considered modest. There, he was too bold. He felt his face flush. Not out of shame, but because I realized, with intensity, that I had crossed a border that went beyond the map. I had entered a universe with codes that were not my own. Despite this, there was no coldness. There was, yes, a kind of silent respect that she came to understand over time. When I walked through the markets, sellers offered their products friendly but always kept their distance. The women, especially the older ones, watched her with attentive eyes, as if they wanted to protect her from what she didn't yet know. Isabel started paying more attention. He realized how ritualistic dinners were, how the gesture of serving tea meant more than hospitality, it was almost a symbol of honor. She learned that refusing food could sound like an insult and that the silences between conversations were as valuable as the words spoken. And even then, it wasn't easy. She often felt torn. I missed talking loudly, laughing without thinking, and hugging without fear. He missed the informality, the spontaneity that was part of his way of living. Here, everything was more contained. There was no room for impulses. And that, as fascinating as it was, also made her feel trapped at certain moments. It was during a local celebration that this internal division was accentuated. Claire invited her to a festive evening with her husband's family. It was a special occasion, and Isabel decided to dress like other women, with a traditional outfit that covered her arms, legs, and part of her hair. When he looked in the mirror, he almost didn't recognize himself. Not that she was ugly. On the contrary. There was a serene elegance to that image. But it was like seeing another version of herself, more restrained, more silent, more obedient. At the party, he noticed how conversations flowed politely but carefully measured. There was laughter, but it was soft. Men talked in one space, women in another. It was all very different from what I was used to. Still, it was well received. They offered him sweets, perfumes, and stories. And even without speaking the language fluently, he felt affection in the gestures. That night, before going to sleep, Isabel thought about how the love between her and Adam had been formed precisely in the midst of these differences. He was created in that universe of norms and tradition. She, daughter of spontaneity and European freedom. And yet, they had found each other. How was this possible? Perhaps because true love is not fed by what is equal but by what is complete. And perhaps, in that encounter between cultures, she was beginning to understand something bigger, that to love someone from another world, you must first make room within yourself for a new way of existing. In the days that followed that celebration, Isabel began to observe the city with new eyes. The differences that previously caused discomfort began to awaken in her a deeper kind of curiosity. I no longer just saw the contrast between lifestyles, I saw a different way of feeling, communicating, and belonging. I walked the streets with less haste, more attentively. The phrases exchanged between sellers and customers, the small gestures between neighbors, the way children played in the squares while the elderly smiled under the shade of the palm trees, everything seemed to have a different meaning than what she knew. Not better, not worse. Just another one. And this, little by little, filled spaces inside her that were previously empty. One hot afternoon, Claire invited her to visit an ancient village on the outskirts of the city, known for its preserved traditions. The place was small, but it held centuries of stories. The houses had colorful doors, the walls were decorated with handmade tiles, and the smell in the air mixed cinnamon, sand, and dried flowers. There, time seemed to be in no hurry. During their visit, they were greeted by a lady who offered mint tea and shared memories of her youth with quiet wisdom. Isabel listened with respect, even without understanding everything that was said. It was enough to observe the woman's eyes, the gestures of her hands, and the cadence of her words. It was like reading a book in another language but still feeling the emotion of the story. In that environment so different from what she knew, Isabel felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. And he realized, with surprise, that this did not come from adapting to the place but from recognizing the humanity that lived there. Deep down, people weren't so different. They had similar fears, similar desires, and the same desire to love and be loved. Upon returning home, Claire commented, "Sometimes, we need to leave where we are comfortable to discover parts of ourselves that never had space to be born." Isabel remained silent, absorbing that sentence as if it were an echo of something she already knew but had not yet put into words. It was at that moment that she understood something essential: culture shock was not a barrier to be overcome. It was a mirror that forced her to see herself from unexpected angles. Seeing herself through the eyes of another culture made her question not only her certainties but also her insecurities. Was his idea of freedom really freedom, or just habit? Did your concept of strength always need to be accompanied by independence, or was there strength also in delicacy, in silence, in listening? These questions began to shape new choices. Isabel started to dress more comfortably for herself, respecting the environment, but without giving up her own identity. He learned some local words, began to greet with more intention, and began to understand the right moments to speak and to be silent. Small adjustments that weren't concessions, they were bridges. She began to realize that carrying her roots didn't mean rejecting others. And that loving someone from a different culture required more than passion. It required a willingness to learn, humility to recognize failures, and courage to change, not through imposition, but through empathy. When remembering the moments with Adam, he realized how he, from the beginning, had tried to create this meeting space. He never forced her into anything, but he was always patient with her mistakes, kind with her doubts, and curious about her story. He didn't try to fit her into his world, he built, with her, a new space, made up of a mixture of both. And it was in this space that love was born. That night, Isabel wrote a short but powerful sentence in her notebook: "Understanding others is, deep down, a way of understanding yourself too." That phrase kept resonating in his mind as he looked out his bedroom window, watching the city breathe at night. The city that once intimidated her now welcomed her in a subtle way. And, somehow, she knew that she would take it all with her, not in her suitcase, but in her eyes, in her words, in her attitudes. The culture that surrounded, challenged, and provoked her had also become part of her. Not as a new identity, but as an extension of your own humanity. The past has a cruel way of creeping in, even when the door appears to be locked. For Isabel, this became evident when, one calm night, her cell phone vibrated with an unexpected notification, an email. The sender? Michael. She hesitated before opening it. He had been silent for weeks, as if he had finally accepted that everything between them had ended. But that message brought back a wave of memories that she preferred to keep buried. And, even worse, it rekindled a fear that was beginning to disappear. The content of the email was apparently harmless. Well-chosen words, polite sentences, and subtle questions about how she was, where she was staying, and if she needed anything. But Isabel knew that tone. It was the same one Michael used when he wanted to regain control without arousing suspicion. And there, between the lines, was what she feared most: he was still watching her. Somehow, even from afar, he stayed close. She recalled the early years of their relationship. At first, Michael seemed like the ideal partner. Affectionate, intelligent, protective. He always had the right arguments, the right advice, the perfect way to show that he cared. Isabel, still young and insecure, believed she had found someone who would help her grow. And for a while, he indeed was that. But, little by little, the affection turned to criticism. Care became control. When she got excited about a new project, he would make her question her decisions with subtle comments. "Are you sure you can handle it?" and "Do you really think this is for you?" And so, Isabel began to diminish. His dreams became quieter, his desires more discreet. Michael never screamed. He was never aggressive. But his words were sharp weapons, and his constant presence was like a shadow, always stretching a little further over her. His friends started moving away. He didn't say he didn't like them, he just insinuated that they weren't good for her. Her family started seeing her less and less, not because he forbade it, but because she no longer had the energy to argue. It was like being trapped in an invisible cage, constructed of subtle gestures and carefully spoken phrases. It took Isabel years to realize that this wasn't love. That the comfort of routine was actually an emotional prison. And it was only when she had the opportunity to leave the country, for Claire's wedding, that something inside her reversed. For the first time, she could breathe away from his constant presence. And in that newfound space, he found Adam. Michael noticed the change almost immediately, even from a distance. All it took was an ignored video call and a post that she didn't respond to for him to understand that something had changed. And the silence that followed was just a harbinger of what was to come. Now, sitting in front of the screen of that new email, Isabel felt butterflies in her stomach. The words were polite, but the effect was the same as always. She felt watched. Shrunken. Vulnerable. As if all the progress I had made in the last few months could collapse with just one click. She didn't respond. I knew that any word would be an opening. But he couldn't sleep that night. The memories came in waves. The day he tried to cut his hair shorter, he said he preferred women with femininity. The time she refused to accompany him to a party and he spent 3 days without speaking to her. The looks that seemed affectionate but carried a silent expectation, be the way I want. That morning, Isabel understood that she needed to take a firmer stance. He couldn't allow that bond, even from a distance, to still have power over his peace. It was time to face reality. Michael had not accepted the end. And she could no longer pretend that this wasn't dangerous. The following days were marked by constant restlessness. Isabel tried to maintain her routines, visit the places that now brought her comfort, and write in her notebook every night, but Michael's thoughts hovered over everything. It was like a shadow growing silently, slowly stretching until it covered the spaces she had been trying so hard to illuminate. Claire noticed the change. She had always been attentive to the signs. During a lazy breakfast, he delicately commented, "You seem more tense. Has something happened?" Isabel hesitated. She didn't want to worry her cousin, but hiding everything also suffocated her. Then she told her about the email, about the feeling of being watched, and about the fear that was growing inside her again. Claire listened silently, her face serious. When Isabel finished, she responded firmly, "You know this isn't normal, right? That's not caring. That's control." These words echoed inside Isabel as a confirmation of what she already knew but was reluctant to accept. Michael hadn't changed. He had only learned to camouflage his own poison better. Even without responding to the message, the signs that he was not far away began to multiply. A mutual friend texted her to ask if she was still in Dubai. An acquaintance commented that Michael had asked strange questions about his trip. And then, a discreet notification appeared on the hotel app where she was staying, an attempt to log in with his email. It was little, but enough to set off all the alarms. Isabel felt her skin crawl. The distance that once protected her now seemed like an illusion. Michael didn't need to be physically there to manipulate the environment around her. He worked behind the scenes, trying to recover what he thought still belonged to him, the idea that she would always be his. But Isabel was no longer that woman who kept silent to avoid conflicts. Something inside her had changed. The pain of loss, contact with another culture, and the true love she had experienced with Adam, all of this had built a new foundation. She now recognized what she deserved. And, above all, what I wasn't willing to accept again. The following afternoon, he went to the local police and registered a report with the data he had. He showed the messages, explained the situation, and promised to provide more information if anything new emerged. He didn't know if that would result in real protection, but just by verbalizing his fear, he felt stronger. I was no longer just a victim, I was taking control back. The night arrived with dry heat and clear skies. Isabel went up to the terrace of the building where Claire lived. I needed air. I needed silence. There, between the warm wind and the city lights, she allowed herself to cry. But it wasn't a cry of weakness. It was the cry of someone who was finally freeing themselves from the weight of an unhealthy past. She remembered the first time Adam looked her in the eye and said, "You don't have to be small to fit into anyone." That sentence, said so lightly, now made more sense than ever. For years, she had molded herself to please, to avoid friction, to keep the peace. But that peace was too costly, it cost its very essence. It was also that night that Isabel wrote a simple but definitive sentence in her notebook: "I will never again be captive to the will of another." She wrote it down, read it out loud, and felt something inside her reorganize. It was as if he was redrawing the contours of freedom itself. The next day, when he woke up, he noticed that something had changed in the air. It was not the end of the problems. Security was not guaranteed. But it was a start. A turning point. For the first time in a long time, she had faced the threat without running away. She had said, with attitudes, that she would no longer allow anyone to decide for her what was right or wrong. Michael could continue to lurk, but now she knew, he no longer had power over his life. Grief didn't come all at once. It gradually infiltrated, like humidity that invades through the cracks in an old house. Isabel no longer cried all the time, but she also didn't smile naturally. It was like living between two worlds, one that suddenly fell apart and another that had not yet fully formed. Even weeks after the accident, there were days when I woke up believing that everything had been a nightmare. And then, all you had to do was look at the empty pillow next to you or feel the absence of the soft perfume that Adam wore for reality to return with full force. The pain came silently but cut deep. She was unable to visit the accident site. It was far from there. I preferred to remember him in places where they had laughed together, where life seemed easy, where their eyes met with the calm of someone who recognized home. The garden where they talked for the first time, the cafe hidden in the old center, the terrace where he asked her to stay. These spaces became sacred to Isabel. They were the points of contact with what I had lost but also with what I had learned. Because, despite the longing that consumed her, something inside her began to want to live again. Not in the same way. But with different eyes. During this time, she developed an unexpected habit. He started writing letters to Adam. Every week, he chose a day and sat on the same bench in a peaceful park, surrounded by trees and silence. There, I put on paper everything I wanted to say to him, questions, memories, and confessions. Sometimes he wrote about his day. Other times, I would just say thank you. Never reread. He finished it, folded the paper carefully, and stored it in a small wooden box. These letters became her way of keeping Adam close. Not as an anchor that prevented her from moving forward, but as a bridge between the love she had lived and the life that still needed to be built. And it was in this process, almost unconsciously, that Isabel began to change. The face gradually gained color. Clothes are back in style. The walks got longer. The sketchbook, which used to be a silent refuge, began to be filled with landscapes with light, traces of freedom, and symbols that previously had no space. It was as if, with each stroke, she reconstituted something within herself. Claire followed this transformation carefully. I knew that grief was an unpredictable process. That the pain didn't follow a calendar. But he also knew that Isabel's rebirth could not be rushed. It needed to be born from her, and it was being born. One rainy night, Claire found her sitting on the porch, looking at the sky as if searching for something. Isabel didn't cry. But his eyes were wet. When her cousin approached and asked if everything was okay, she replied something that Claire would never forget. Today I realized that I can carry the nostalgia and still keep walking. It was the first time Isabel said out loud something she had been feeling for a while. That pain was no longer a prison but a reminder. A reminder that I had experienced something rare. Who had loved deeply. And that, as much as it hurt, was also a reason to be proud. She didn't want to forget Adam. I never wanted to. But I also no longer wanted to live as if I had stopped in time. And in that moment, as the rain fell thinly, he felt something like relief. A breath. A silver lining. As the weeks passed, something changed inside Isabel. The pain was still there, but it had lost its power to paralyze her. She began to understand that the suffering would not disappear overnight, and perhaps it would never go away completely. But that didn't mean she couldn't move on. One day, upon returning from the market, he stopped in front of a window that he had never noticed. It was a small ceramics store. Inside, a lady was molding clay with slow, calm movements. There was something hypnotic about that scene. Isabel stayed there for a few minutes, watching. When the lady looked up and smiled at her, something stirred inside. The next day, she returned. And he entered. He asked if they offered classes. The woman, with a thick accent and a kind look, just pointed to a counter and said, "Sit down. The hands will learn before the mind." And that's exactly what happened. Ceramics became her silent therapy. Between one piece and another, Isabel realized that creating required presence. It was impossible to shape clay by thinking about the past. Each gesture demanded attention and dedication. And every week, a new piece was born between his fingers. Some came out crooked, others cracked in the oven. But still, she continued. This process, so simple at first glance, was revealing. Clay didn't ask for perfection. It accepted mistakes, adapted forms, and even when it broke, it could be rebuilt. Isabel began to see herself there. As someone who had already left but now chose to remake themselves, not as before, but in a new way. One afternoon, while finishing a small vase, he felt an intense desire to visit Adam's grave. Until then, he had avoided that moment. It was as if, by going there, he was admitting that everything was truly over. But now, the idea didn't seem so scary. Maybe because she finally understood that the love they shared didn't end with their physical absence. He continued. It changed shape, but it remained. The next day, with a bouquet of white flowers in her hands, Isabel walked to the place where Adam had been buried. The cemetery was simple and silent. The wind blew lightly, as if it knew it no longer needed to shout to be heard. As he approached the tombstone, he felt his heart racing. His hands shook slightly, but his steps were steady. He sat down on the grass and remained there in silence. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. It just remained. When he finally got up, he took a small ceramic sculpture out of his pocket, the first one he had managed to make without breaking it, and placed it on the stone. "I'm back," he whispered. And with those words, a cycle closed inside her. That same day, Isabel made a decision that had been brewing for some time: she would not return to her old life. Not because he wanted to erase his origins but because he no longer fit in with them. The woman who now walked the streets was no longer the same woman who had boarded that plane months ago. She began planning her stay. He looked for a small apartment, looked for art-related job opportunities, and contacted local cultural centers. Each small step represented a reconstruction, not of what she was before, but of what she chose to be now. One night, while writing in his notebook, he wrote a sentence that summed it all up: "My grief became a root. And with it, I began to blossom." It was at that moment that Isabel realized, rebirth is not a sudden break. It is a silent process, like a seed that sprouts underground without anyone noticing, until one day it becomes visible. And now, she was ready to blossom, even though she knew the pain would be part of who she was. The scar on Isabel's arm had already closed, but inside it there were still open wounds. Despite the emotional progress she had been building with effort, there was something that wouldn't leave her alone: the abrupt and nebulous way in which Adam had died. In the background, an insistent voice repeated the same question: what if it wasn't a simple accident? For a long time, she tried to silence this doubt. After all, carrying the grief was heavy enough. However, there were details that didn't fit together, small clues that didn't match the official version of the facts. The memory of the dark car following them on that road, the minutes before impact, Adam's attempt to maintain control of the steering wheel, it was all too vivid to ignore. One afternoon, while organizing personal documents, he found a forgotten folder with copies of the police file. He read everything again, more calmly. This time, something caught his attention. The report indicated that the offending car had never been accurately identified. Cameras near the scene had captured a similar vehicle driving around days earlier, but no further investigation had been carried out. The conclusion was vague, almost lazy. The discomfort turned into restlessness. And restlessness, need. Isabel realized that she could not truly move forward without understanding what had really happened. And, above all, without knowing who was behind the tragedy. Determined, she contacted a lawyer known to Claire's family, someone respected who had good contacts in the city. During the meeting, he explained everything in great detail, from the chase on the road to Michael's history of threats. The lawyer listened attentively, taking notes and observing her every reaction. "You have more than guesses," he said at last. "There are signs that justify reopening the investigation. But if we go down this path, know that you could upset dangerous people. Are you ready for that?" Isabel didn't hesitate. For the first time since the accident, he felt something other than pain, he felt purpose. "I do not seek revenge," he replied. "I just want the truth." In the following days, he began to gather what he could. Old images, archived messages, informal testimonies from acquaintances. Claire helped her with whatever she could, and the lawyer sent a formal request to the authorities to have the case reopened. While waiting for a response, Isabel relived the memory of the accident with different eyes. "I no longer just saw the moment of collision, I saw the slow construction of a trap. And the more I thought, the more I realized that Michael's silence, after public mourning, perhaps wasn't a retreat, but a strategy. It was then that he received an unexpected call. A cautious male voice saying that there was important information about the case. It was a private detective hired by another client who came across clues that involved Adam in bigger deals than Isabel imagined. "Can we talk in person?" he asked. "There are things that may change everything you know." As she hung up, Isabel felt the floor wobble. Would you be prepared to hear what you didn't want? What if the truth wasn't so simple? What if there were more people involved than she ever suspected? The search for justice, he realized, is not a straight path. It is tortuous, uncertain, and requires courage to deal with revelations that are not always comforting. But she was ready. In memory of Adam. For the peace I hadn't yet found. And for herself. The meeting with the private detective was scheduled for a discreet cafe, away from the tourist area. Isabel arrived before the scheduled time. She was tense but determined. His hands trembled slightly as he held the cup of tea, but his eyes never left the entrance to the place. When the man appeared, wearing simple clothes and a serious expression, she knew that this wasn't just any meeting. He introduced himself only as Julian. He did not give details about who had previously hired him but made it clear that what he discovered could not be ignored. He opened a small folder and placed some photos on the table. In one of them, Adam appeared alongside two unknown men in front of a commercial building in Dubai. These two have a suspicious history. One of them is linked to illegal financial operations with shell companies. And the other, Julian paused, has relations with a very well-known figure behind the scenes in the city's real estate business. Isabel looked at the images, confused. Are you saying Adam was involved with those kinds of people? Julian shook his head. Not necessarily. There are chances that he was trying to report something. But the fact is, he knew too much. And that, in this world, can be fatal. The words hung heavy in the air. Isabel felt as if what little ground she still had under her feet was beginning to crumble. He always imagined that the threat came only from Michael, his obsession, his toxic behaviors, his traces of control. But now, there was a new layer of complexity. Adam could have been the target of something bigger, something that went beyond jealousy and rejection. Julian then showed another piece of information, Michael's entry records into Dubai days before the accident. Images from security cameras at a hotel near the crash site. The same silhouette. The same outfit Isabel remembered him wearing on a visit to her parents' house months before. What's more, the car used in the accident had been rented by a recently opened company, which, upon further investigation, led to a hidden partner, with business connections in common with Michael. "This is enough to raise a serious inquiry," said Julian. "But the question is, are you ready to deal with the exposure? The consequences?" Isabel didn't respond right away. He looked at the street through the cafe window. The flow of people, the cars passing by, the sun reflecting on the buildings in the distance. For a second, she felt small in the face of the immensity of it all. But he soon remembered Adam's look on the last day they were together. He hadn't said anything to her in words, but his eyes, in that moment of silence in the car, had said it all. "Trust yourself." "Yes," he replied, looking back at Julian. "I want to keep this going until the end." In the days that followed, the pieces began to fall into place. With the help of the lawyer and the detective, Isabel put together a complete dossier, full of details, dates, names, records, and suspicions. With each new discovery, the case stopped being just a personal tragedy and revealed itself to be part of a much broader scheme. The justice she sought, however, was not driven by revenge. She was driven by a real need to clear Adam's name, to honor his memory. He wasn't just the victim of an accident. He had been silenced. And Isabel would not rest until this was recognized. Even though she knew she was messing with influential forces, she remained firm. And deep down, there was a certainty that guided her: the truth, no matter how much it hurts, will always be better than doubt. Because living without answers is carrying the weight of 1,000 questions. The sunrise looked different that morning. Isabel woke up earlier than usual, not because she couldn't sleep but because something inside her was pulsing with intensity. For the first time in a long time, he felt in control. Not completely free from pain nor free from fears. But finally, able to choose. For weeks, he had focused on the search for the truth, on the documents, on the conversations, on the minute details of the investigation. But now, after so much effort, he realized that his fight was not just for justice, it was for his life. Not for survival, but for autonomy. And that was new. From a young age, he had learned to adapt to the wishes of others. First to the parents' expectations, then to Michael's rigidity. Then came the love for Adam, which, even though it was pure, ended abruptly before she could live the experience in full. For a long time, her trajectory was determined by external events, as if she were just a passenger on the train of her own existence. Now, for the first time, Isabel felt like she was about to take the wheel. That morning, she walked alone to the sea. The warm wind hit your face, and the waves gently broke on the sand. It was a common scenario, but to her, everything seemed loaded with meaning. The horizon represented the unknown. And the unknown, now, no longer caused panic. It was synonymous with possibility. She began to go over in her mind the decisions she needed to make. Stay in Dubai or start over somewhere else? Continue with the art exhibition that was being planned or go another way? Stay close to Adam's family or seek a space of your own? These questions no longer scared her. Because I understood that any choice would bring challenges, but it would also bring freedom. And freedom, she learned, is not the absence of pain. It is the ability to make conscious choices, even when the past still whispers doubts in your ear. On the way home, he found Claire on the porch, taking care of some plants. Without exchanging many words, they sat side by side, watching the blue sky. After a few minutes, Claire said, "You look different. More whole." Isabel smiled, not in response but in silent confirmation. It was true. Something inside her rearranged itself. Not because the pain went away, but because she refused to let it define what came next. And that made all the difference. That same night, Isabel dreamed again. But this time there were no chases, no speeding cars, no painful goodbyes. He dreamed of a house by the sea, with white walls and light curtains blowing in the breeze. She was sitting on the floor, drawing, while laughter echoed in the background. I didn't know where they came from nor who owned that voice, but there was peace in the environment. When he woke up, he understood, it wasn't a dream. It was a vision of what I wanted to build. In the following days, he began to write concrete plans. He looked for small art studios, talked to local galleries, and explored the possibility of giving painting and sculpture workshops. He realized there was room for her in this new setting, not as a tourist, not as a visitor, but as someone who had something to offer. Every connection you made, every email you sent, was a step towards consolidating your own path. One hot afternoon, he received an unexpected message. It was Adam's mother's. It just said, "I'd like to have some tea with you, if I can." Isabel hesitated for a moment but responded positively. They found themselves in the same garden where she and Adam had first walked together. The woman arrived with a calm look and a slight smile. During the conversation, they spoke little about the past. Instead, they shared light memories, happy moments, and also silences that said more than 1,000 words. At the end of the meeting, the woman took Isabel's hand and said, in a low but firm voice, "Adam chose you because he saw something in you that maybe even you didn't see. Don't lose that." These words kept reverberating inside Isabel. Not as a burden, but as a gentle reminder. The next morning, she made a definitive decision. He wrote to the lawyer, authorizing the process to continue without his constant presence. He had entrusted him with all the documentation and knew that he would continue fighting for justice. But Isabel no longer wanted to live because of the tragedy. "I wanted to live for life." He visited Adam's grave one last time before moving to his new apartment, further away from the center. He took with him a small flame-shaped sculpture, made with his own hands, and left it there, next to the tombstone. "You lit something in me that I will never turn off," he murmured. In the new home, the days began simply. She set up a small studio in the corner of the room. He started teaching children on Saturdays. He planted herbs on the balcony. Painted the walls in light tones. And every night, before going to sleep, he would look up at the sky and whisper words of gratitude, not for everything that had happened, but for everything he was able to do with what life gave him. Freedom, Isabel understood, was not the absence of the past. It was the courage to choose what to do with it. The new apartment still smelled of fresh paint and freshly polished wood. Isabel placed the last paintings on the wall, all made by her, a portrait of her career. Each canvas told a piece of what could not be said in words, losses, ruptures, discoveries, and the beginning of something entirely new. Life had started moving again. The days were full, the nights were quieter. There were still memories, but they no longer hurt like they used to. They had become part of the path, not obstacles. It was different from anything she had ever experienced, no longer chasing something or running away from the past. Now, she moved forward steadily. That week, the news she was waiting for arrived. The Dubai court had issued an official statement acknowledging that Adam's case would be reclassified as a crime, based on the evidence provided by Isabel and her team. It was the beginning of legal proceedings against those involved. Adam's name was finally being cleared. And the truth, even late, had begun to emerge. Isabel took the news calmly. He didn't celebrate out loud, nor did he run to tell everyone. He just closed his eyes and let a tear fall. That's all she wanted, for the story to be heard. That he wasn't just another number on an accident report. Across the ocean, Michael was already being monitored. Authorities had managed to link his movements to the vehicle used in the attack. He was now officially considered a suspect, with an extradition request underway. Isabel didn't need to see him again. I didn't want to. The cycle between them was over. One sunny morning, she received a visit from Claire. They sat on the porch with coffee and fresh bread. The two laughed, talked about life, and for the first time in a long time, no topic about pain came up. It was as if the ghosts had finally been put to sleep. Isabel looked at the city in front of her. I was no longer a tourist nor a foreigner. That place was now part of her, with its hot streets, its silent people, and its different rules. Everything had fallen into place, even if outside of the original plan. She had survived, but more than that, I had chosen to continue living. Time passed. Not much, just enough for the wounds to stop bleeding and start to truly heal. Isabel, now with a defined routine, a functioning studio, and a new exhibition scheduled, would not recognize herself if she looked back. Not because he forgot, but because he evolved. The case involving Adam's death gained international attention. Local newspapers and foreign websites began to report the developments of the investigation. The arrest warrant for Michael was made official, and the connection between him and a criminal network was confirmed. The attempt to silence someone cost a life, but the truth won. Late, but won. Isabel did not participate in the trials. I followed the steps of the process remotely, by choice. He understood that his mission was no longer to pursue justice into his own hands but to continue living in a way that honored the memory of those he lost. This was more powerful than any condemnation. One late afternoon, alone on the terrace of her house, she read the letters she had written to Adam. One by one. No rush. Some made people smile, others brought tears. When he finished, he burned them all. Not out of anger, but out of liberation. The words were already in it. I no longer needed the paper to remember. What he needed to carry, he already carried in his chest. In her new life, Isabel began teaching art to refugee women. It wasn't just about painting or sculpture. It was about helping other women reclaim their voices. About transforming silence into expression. About giving them what she once lacked: space, listening, choice. One day, during a class, a young woman asked, "Have you always been this strong?" Isabel replied, without hesitation, "No. But one day I chose to be. And I never looked back." That was the end point. Not the end of the story, but the end of a phase. The woman who was once controlled, silenced, and shaped by other people's expectations now led her own narrative. Every decision, every new project, every step from then on was hers alone. And if anyone asks how she survived all of this, the answer will be simple. She didn't just survive, she decided to win. I hope you liked this story. Subscribe to the channel to help our channel grow and so you don't miss the next stories. See you in the next videos.